All right, welcome everyone. My name's Heidi White and I am the Group Fitness and Wellness Manager at JCC Greater Boston. Special thanks to Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Beth Israel Deaconess Needham for their partnership and for helping to coordinate the Wellness Speaker Series, including tonight's topic on eating for a healthy heart with Dr. Stephen Jurecic. Dr. Jurecic is a primary care physician and researcher at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. His work involves clinical trials focused on hypertension, healthy aging, and cardiovascular disease prevention. He has published over 225 papers from a diverse range of data sources and has participated in the primary publication of 7 distinct clinical trials focused on nutrition and lifestyle interventions to improve clinical outcomes. He is passionate about the role of nutrition to optimize blood pressure and promote healthy aging in older adults. So before we get started, this is a webinar style, so we can't hear you, we can't see you, but you can use the Q&A feature to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be getting to those questions throughout the webinar. So with that, Dr. Jurecic, I'm going to turn things over to you. Just going to spotlight you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, for this opportunity to join you all today and that wonderful and flattering introduction. I am going to go through the share process, so let me just do that right now. And okay, and then just let me know if can you see the shared screen, okay?
All set.
Great. All right. Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you all today. I actually, when I was um, in undergrad at Boston College, I did some volunteer work at the Jewish Community Center, believe it or not, through the Carroll Center for the Blind. Used to job coach at the summer camp. So anyway, it was a real delight to get invited to speak with you all today. Feel free. This is going to be a compendium of a lot of work we've done around healthy eating. There's some technical aspects, but there's also some community-based aspects as well. And feel free at any point to ask a question or interact. I'd love to hear from you all today. So, okay. And my work is supported by the National Institutes of Health and the American Heart Association. And the first part of the talk is just going to focus on one form of healthy eating called the DASH diet, or dietary approaches to stop hypertension, and two really foundational seminal studies that inform what we know about this approach to healthy eating. And then I focus a little bit on how we're doing in terms of adopting DASH dietary eating patterns in the United States, and then talk about some strategies we've been exploring to address disparities in healthy eating and access and promote adoption of healthy dietary patterns. And so when I talk about the DASH eating plan, this is actually available on the NIH NHLBI website as kind of a really breakdown of the DASH eating plan by number of calories one might consume for their diet. And so for DASH, the diet was heavier in grains, high in servings of fruits and vegetables, emphasized fat-free and low-fat dairy, and focused on lean meats like fish and poultry, and then also nuts, seeds, and legumes. And you can see that based on your calorie needs, the proportion or number of servings would be greater if you required more calories. The dietary pattern also restricted or emphasized reduced consumption of red meat, fat, saturated fats, sweets, and sugar beverages. And I think, when based on modern evidence, the emphasis on total fat is less important than really the emphasis on saturated fat, so unhealthy forms of fat. And for years, this had been ranked the best #1 heart healthy diet by U.S. News and World Report. Now it got supplanted by the Mediterranean diet. But the Mediterranean diet and DASH have a lot of similarities. And I think the main difference, again, is this question around the macronutrient, the fat, the healthy forms of fat that the Mediterranean diet emphasizes. But they're both really excellent approaches to when it comes to optimizing your cardiovascular health. And so, why do we talk about DASH? What's the evidence for it? So, there was this critical paper that was published in 1997. And, up to this time, people had talked about diet for health outcomes. There had been some suggestion that diet could be beneficial. If you look over the history of what was recommended to the public as healthy or good for one's health, you'll see a tremendous evolution over the decades. Yet in the later 1980s, early 1990s, um, Thomas More and some others had kind of emphasized this holistic dietary pattern that became known as DASH. And But yet no one had really kind of put it down to a rigorous test and really defined what it was until this paper and the study was done. And what they did, it was really fascinating. It was four different centers, 459 people. They actually had three different groups that were assigned randomly to a controlled diet that was designed to be kind of like what was typically consumed in the US at that time, a fruits and vegetables diet where folks were that where there was a greater consumption of fruits and vegetables, so there was some improvement, and then this combination diet that later became known as DASH, right? So a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy foods with reduced saturated fat and total fat. And when you look at the construct here, right? So the fat and saturated fat of the fruits and vegetables in the control diet were identical. But for the combination diet or DASH diet, there was a reduction. Cholesterol was reduced for the combination diet. Calcium was higher, and that was part of the increased dairy consumption. And this was another major kind of contrast between the groups. Red meat was reduced. Fish consumption was greater, and then fats, oil, salad dressing was reduced for DASH, and snacks and sweets were also reduced, more so than fruits and vegetables, which was similarly reduced from the control diet. So you can kind of see that while fruits and vegetables did differ from the control diet in some ways in the study, the combination diet, the DASH diet, had some additional important differences. And the primary endpoint of this study was systolic blood pressure. They also looked at diastolic blood pressure. They looked at LDL cholesterol. And unlike a lot of the prior studies on this topic, the researchers were very careful to make sure that body weight was maintained constant throughout the study. And we know that if one loses weight or optimizes their body weight, that can be beneficial for a lot of cardiovascular risk factors like blood sugar, cholesterol, blood pressure. But what hadn't been shown is if you were to isolate just the quality of the diet from the effects of weight, can there be additional health benefits? And I think that's what was illustrated so well and so effectively in this initial trial. And so it was a simple parallel design, right? People were assigned at baseline, followed for 8 weeks. They had blood pressures measured every week. They were fed their meals. There was 459 adults, about half were women, 60% identified as Black, and about a quarter had elevated blood pressure or hypertension. And you can see right away the controlled diet is up here. The fruits and vegetable diet improved blood pressure. And then beyond that, the DASH diet, the combination diet, resulted in even more reduction in systolic blood pressure. A very similar pattern was observed for diastolic blood pressure and for LDL cholesterol. And this very nicely established that diet, the quality of diet, independent of weight and calories, could impact cardiovascular disease risk factors, which is an incredibly important message for preventing cardiovascular disease. And as interestingly, as that study was kind of being wrapped up, now what's amazing is when people talked about the pattern, that combination diet pattern, it hadn't been fully defined or distilled. But when the investigators needed to create a protocol and prepare the menus in a specified way, that was a taking kind of a more subjective description of a balanced diet and putting it down in a very kind of formulaic, standardized approach that others could replicate. So it was kind of a really important advance when we think about nutrition. Now, a very close follow-up, and actually this study was implemented or started while DASH was still completing, was DASH sodium, and this was published in 2001, so about 4 years later. And one of the key features, if I go back, that people often think about with blood pressure, and rightly so, is sodium, because sodium is known to be strongly related to blood pressure. But what was not clear is if sodium, independent of DASH, could also lower blood pressure, right? And so in this original study, you can kind of see that sodium down here under the calcium line was kept relatively constant. That was not just like weight. That was not an intended question of the original DASH study. But when you went to DASH sodium, the investigators asked, can sodium reduction, independent of DASH dietary pattern, or dietary quality, can that additionally lower blood pressure? And what is that combined effect? And so this study was slightly smaller. It had fewer centers, um, but it included 412 participants and with similar demographic profiles. And there was 12 weeks of DASH versus control, so slightly longer in duration. But then each person ate one of three sodium level layered on top of the DASH or controlled diet. So like the original DASH trial, people were assigned either DASH or control, but then for 4 weeks, they got a high sodium level, 4 weeks a medium sodium level, 4 weeks a low sodium level. And that was assigned in random order in blinded fashion. And this is the effect on systolic blood pressure, again, the primary endpoint. And so you can see for control versus DASH, so the kind of ovals versus the squares, that the DASH diet, once again, independently in a different population, lowered blood pressure, right? So that's good. We replicated the first study findings. But in addition, we have high, intermediate, and low sodium level. And you can see that regardless of sodium level, DASH lowered blood pressure. And compared across the diets, going from lower sodium level added additional reduction in blood pressure. Now, this wasn't quite as, it wasn't fully additive. The authors will say it was sub-additive, right? Like this square isn't down here, for example. But this is encouraging to think about how both low sodium and a DASH dietary pattern together can really maximize your blood pressure reduction and optimize it. And we went back to the DASH sodium study and we're like asking the question, well, this is great for people maybe who don't have severe disease. But what if you came into the study and you had a systolic blood pressure above 150 or above 140, which by today's standards would say, okay, you need to be treated for your hypertension, right? Well, when we looked at this study and looked at the combined effect of the DASH diet and low sodium based on where people were starting, what we found is that the effect of the diet was greater the worse your baseline blood pressure was. So if you were less than 130, well, you still got some benefit, 5 millimeters of mercury. But if you are 150, it was nearly 20, which is on par, if not greater, than many medications. A lot of medications are in the 7 to 10 range. And so this suggests that really diet should be used for anybody at any degree of uncontrolled blood pressure. I have no issues with medications, of course, but diet is very effective, even among individuals with very high blood pressure. How long does it take to see an effect? This is another question we asked of the DASH sodium data. And is 4 weeks enough to see the effect of sodium? And so looking at the diet effect over time, what we observed is that the blood pressure contrast between DASH and control, seen on the left here, was established relatively early, as much as 2 weeks in. So if you were to change your diet today, by the end of 2 weeks, you should start seeing a benefit in your blood pressure, that happens quite rapidly and can be sustained over the study period for both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. With respect on the right-hand side to sodium, we didn't have as much time because each person only had 4 weeks of each of the sodium levels. But you can see here we have high in red, the red squares, and low, the blue diamonds. And we have the control group for systolic and diastolic blood pressure, A and C, and the DASH assignment, B and D, for systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And what you can see is, at least on the control group, that there was really stability in the blood pressure on the high sodium over time, suggesting that they did a good job of kind of mirroring a typical US diet. But the low sodium group had this linear reduction, and the trend was significant over the 4 weeks of the sodium level, suggesting that a plateau of effect had not been achieved at the end of a 4 week period. So we don't know if the benefit could be even greater with a longer duration of sodium reduction, particularly in the control group. Now, in the DASH group, that trend was not as clear for systolic blood pressure, though potentially for diastolic, something similar might have been observed. But overall, this suggests that we might be underestimating the true benefit of sodium reduction over time. And we could even observe greater effects if people stick with the sodium reduction. Now, one might say, well, this is great. I want to improve my risk factors for cardiovascular disease. In many ways, that is an important first step to having a heart healthy life. But part of the reason why people kind of gravitated towards the Mediterranean diet is because a large trial called Predimed showed that the Mediterranean diet lowered cardiovascular disease events. And for many, myself included, we might say, well, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, they're very important risk factors. But if I could reduce direct injury to the heart, then that's even more impressive. That's really kind of getting to the downstream, what we're all about, what we're trying to avoid. There hasn't been a large trial like that in the United States. I kind of hope there would be at some point. But in absence of that, we were able to go to stored specimens of the DASH study and measure highly specific, highly sensitive markers of subclinical cardiac injury. So from proteins that are in heart muscle that are released when the heart muscle is damaged or died. Heart strain. So there's a marker called proBNP that's released when the heart stretches. It's commonly used for heart failure. And generalized inflammation. So high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which many have looked to as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And so we had specimens from 326 of the original DASH participants and measured cardiac troponin I, NT-proBNP, and a high sensitivity C-reactive protein at baseline and at 8 months for each of the 3 arms. And our thought was, well, if the diets are truly improving the risk factors, then we should see some benefit on the heart and on some clinical cardiac injury, strain, and general inflammation. And this is what we found, that compared to a control diet, the fruits and vegetables and the DASH diet seemed to lower high sensitivity troponin I, so cardiac injury, and cardiac strain. Not so much generalized inflammation, but this supported this idea that not only were the diets benefiting the risk factors very quickly, but they were also directly benefiting heart health in reducing subclinical injury. And these markers are used for both the diagnosis of heart attack and for acute decompensated heart failure. They're strongly predictive of future events. And so they're excellent surrogates of cardiovascular events long term. And in many ways, this is the kind of effect you would hope to see with a short term intervention. So, very, very encouraging. Now, it kind of suggests that, yeah, even though there was more risk factor reduction with DASH, fruits and vegetables seem to do as well with respect to the cardiac or end organ damage and injury. But again, uh, uh, I think it's encouraging that the both healthier diets emphasizing fruits and vegetables had some end organ evidence of benefit. Now, what about sodium? So we did the same. We took the same strategy for the DASH sodium trial. In this case, we had 411 of the original 412 participants from 1,500 specimens. We had a baseline, and then we had at the end of each of the sodium levels the same three markers. And at this point, because we were doing it later, our thought was, well, DASH should lower subclinical cardiac injury and strain, but not inflammation. And sodium reduction, we thought, would be consistent. And this is what we found. Panel A is the troponin I, so the heart injury. Panel B is the heart strain, and C is the generalized inflammation. And what we saw was that the DASH diet, interestingly enough, lowered heart injury, but sodium did not seem to do that. However, sodium did seem to strongly relate to heart strain. Now, again, this is a group without cardiovascular disease. We know that low sodium is recommended for people with heart failure. So if we were at the extreme levels of NT-proBNP, people with real pronounced disease, this makes perfect sense. But this is showing in a kind of preventive population a very similar and consistent relationship. And then we saw this kind of bizarre relationship with inflammation, whereby lower sodium seemed to increase inflammation, and it was paradoxical, but yet something that others had reported as well, but kind of curious. And when we put it together, so if we have the combined contrast, low sodium DASH versus high sodium control, what we saw is an overall net 20% reduction in subclinical cardiac injury, about a 23% reduction in NT-proBNP, and then a kind of null effect on C-reactive protein. So in some sense, some consistency, some differences, but some consistency with what we had observed with the DASH trial data. Now, why wasn't things a little bit more consistent? My suspicion is that going back to the diets, this small reduction in sodium prepared, 2,800 versus 3,000, again, these are estimated. Maybe there was a subtle sodium reduction that could explain the BNP relationship observed in this trial. We'll never fully know, but it's certainly suggestive and would reconcile all of the findings together. But for the most part, I think we should feel quite confident that DASH is an effective approach to optimize our cardiovascular risk factors, even beyond fruits and vegetables, but at least with fruits and vegetables too. Sodium has an independent effect that can, when brought in to a DASH pattern, can provide additional benefits for blood pressure. These combined effects are greater in adults with poorly controlled blood pressure at baseline, so we shouldn't give up on ourselves if we're kind of at the upper end of the spectrum. We shouldn't ignore this if we think we're relatively okay. Everyone benefits, but some of the benefit can be even greater depending on where you are. The onset is rapid. The effects seem to be sustained, and there may be direct benefits to cardiac injury and strain, which are important for thinking about long-term cardiovascular health. Okay. I don't know if there are any thoughts or questions at this point. I'll continue if not, or I can pause. Okay. All right. Oh, and Heidi, I don't know if you're
Second,
talking. Okay, sorry.
hold on one second. I just
No
lost
problem.
you.
Oh, okay.
All right, here we are. Well,
Good.
Add spotlight. There we go.
Okay.
Actually, one question was raised, that was emailed to me. Can you avoid taking blood pressure lowering medications by changing your eating habits?
So that's a really great question. And that's a motivation for many people. Um, and I think the answer is complicated. So you could say, yes, if I bring my number down, right? Certainly, right? If you were at 150 in dash and your blood pressure went down 20 millimeters of mercury and landed, at 130 or less than 130, some people might say, you don't need treatment anymore, right? So in that sense, yes, you could avoid treatment. Is that the wisest strategy from a hypertension management perspective? I think that's subject to debate. And the reason I say that is because blood pressure is not like a height, right? And when you think about a unit of measurement, I think a lot of clinicians, even a lot of hypertension experts, they'll say, oh, well, do you have hypertension? Do you not have hypertension? Well, the truth of the matter is, if you take a series of blood pressure measurements, one after the other, you could have a blood pressure that is hypertensive, then a minute later, a blood pressure that's normotensive, and then a minute later, a blood pressure that's a little bit different. Why? Because our devices are imprecise. Blood pressure is a physiologic parameter that associates with each heart rate. Your environment can change. It can be based on your state of mind, temperature, the ambient situation, loud noise that can alter the blood pressure. It's technically difficult to perform. For all of these reasons, we need to think about blood pressure more as a distribution. And so, that being said, you might say, well, I adopted a healthy diet. I got my blood pressure where I want it to be. That's my get out of jail free card. But let's say you go to a special event. Let's say a special time of year, a holiday time of year. Let's say you're going through a stressful period at work, or part of your day is very calm and relaxing. Part of your day is not so relaxing or is intense. In traffic, for example, we'll never know those blood pressures. So, in some sense, you could also say, well, what is the harm of treatment? If I can bring all my blood pressures down safely to a safe zone, I could be protecting myself against some harmful high blood pressures that are inevitable as part of my day to day life and experience. And so I think it really depends on how you want to manage your risk. Um, Interestingly, in September, I gave a debate. It was kind of an interesting, contrived debate, and I have some interesting backstories about how it came out to be. But it was about resistant hypertension. So these are people who are on 3 medications already. One of the debate options was to use renal denervation to kind of cauterize the nerves and the renal vessels to lower blood pressure. It's an emerging technique. I think sometimes companies are pushing it quite a bit, but nevertheless, it has some promise. Another option was to add an antihypertensive medication. And then someone asked me to present on lifestyle. And this is a highly medicated population. And I was like, man, I've got a really tough argument to make here against these two other folks who kind of have good rationale. Add more meds or do a procedure. But when I looked into the literature, sure enough, there were some great studies in resistant hypertensive patients showing that lifestyle, sometimes it's diet, sometimes it was the intervention and it was comprehensive, was optimizing your body weight, it had to do with physical exercise, healthy eating. But time and time again, the lifestyle was very effective in reducing blood pressure, even in folks who are highly medicated. And one of the pushbacks people made, it was a friendly debate, but the people made some good points. They're like, well, listen, the lifestyle is just too hard to do well. And to do it the way they did it in Dash, that required all these monitoring and controls and support and ready prepared meals, people are not going to be successful. But my counter argument was, well, there is no escaping the lifestyle. The lifestyle has pleiotropic benefits. It's going to benefit your cholesterol. It's going to benefit your energy. It's going to benefit your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your caloric intake, so many different domains that we can't even if we don't ultimately reach our ideal for a lifestyle, we still have to strive for it because that's slowing down disease progression, which is prevalent in the United States. We have hypertension epidemic, and it's 85% of older adults over age 65. It's commonplace. So the only protection we have is to strive to improve our lifestyle. So regardless of whether you're medicated or not, it's something that we need to pay attention to. Whether or not you take that as a strategy to not be medicated, some people find value in that. Others recognize that you can do both and have a better risk factor management style, and that's okay as well. So,
Questions right now? We can probably move on.
all right, great. So, um, what about adoption, right? So, it presented a lot of evidence occurring in the late 90s or early 2000s on DASH. And, this was a survey recently taken in 2024, and only 2% of US adults had ever even heard of the DASH diet. I don't know today. I suspect this group who attends the seminar probably has heard of this before, but really not very positive in terms of just our dissemination of knowledge. And I actually have this cool slide. I don't show it today, but it was I think one of the like those Jeopardy champion episodes. And it was like the second round, and they asked the best of the best of Jeopardy, what does the H in dash stand for? And no one got it. No one knew it was hypertension. So the general population, the most trivia savvy folks in the population, haven't really heard about DASH. And this is also reflected in economic data from the USDA. If you look at trends in US consumption between 1970 and 2015, this is what's recommended, the horizontal line. The 1970 is the blue, 2015 the red. You can see we are super exceeding what's recommended for our meat, eggs, and nuts. Obviously, the categories don't fully align with DASH, but you can tell, like with the meat side of things, we're doing a little bit too much. Grains, there's been improvement in grains. One might argue, what kind of grains? Are we doing the healthy grains or the unhealthy types of grains? But then fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy, or dairy in general, there really hasn't been a major improvement over this 35-year span. So a lot of work to be done. How about when it comes to health disparities? This is a really fascinating study that used data from the NHANES, which is supposed to be nationally representative. And they looked at folks consuming the proportion consuming an ideal diet, heart healthy diet, and then those consuming a poor diet. And they stratified by if you received SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and there were about 42 million folks on receiving SNAP benefits in 2017, or if you were higher income. So there's a simple breakdown. And what they found is that if you were receiving SNAP, less than 1% would be identified as having an ideal diet in 2003 and 2004. And this didn't noticeably improve over the 12 years that they looked at the trend. In contrast, higher income adults, the reality is they're not much better in terms of ideal status, right? About 1 percentage point higher, but there was a little bit more improvement over time. Now, what about where do most people lie? Well, most folks would be classified as eating a poor diet. And for those SNAP recipients, over half fell into the poor diet category with zero improvement over the years of the trend in the United States. Meanwhile, in the higher income adults, not only were they about 10% lower in terms of poor diet classification, but there was also a 10% improvement. And so when you kind of think about this over time, there are gains being made in healthy eating, but we seem to be doing better on the public health side among folks of higher income. and we're not doing very well among folks of lower income. And I think that's of concern because disparities could be worsening. When we think about cardiovascular disease endpoints, I think lifestyle is a starting point, right? And so this is where I think a lot of our work has been focusing on how can we address the gaps in knowledge, address the access to improve a translation of these really important findings. And so we've worked on a couple different studies related to these issues. One in older adults of low socioeconomic status with limited transportation. And then currently we're doing 2 trials among Black families living in urban food deserts in Boston. And I'm going to try to move a little bit faster just because I have a lot of slides and I want to save some time for discussion. But our first study looked at a low sodium meal plan in a congregate living facility called Jack Satter House. And what we looked at is whether or not a low sodium meal plan could safely reduce blood pressure among these residents. So this was like a feasibility study. We would travel from PI all the way up to Revere. This is the dietary nutrition committee that came up with our name, and this was an individual randomized trial in Section 202 HUD subsidized housing. And we had these 2 sodium meal plans. We looked at blood pressure. We looked at orthostatic hypotension, a timed up and go test. We asked questions about falls, and then we looked at sodium in the urine. This was a simple design. It was a real labor of love, a lot of volunteerism. We conducted it over a 2-week period. We had about 20 volunteers, ages 60 or older, with these kinds of blood pressures, some normal range blood pressures, unstable blood pressure medications. These were the diets we targeted. You can see we focused on energy levels. So we had 3 different energy levels, proportion of carbohydrates similar to DASH. The typical sodium was consistent with the U.S. diet for sodium level. And then also we tried to target consistency with potassium. And you can see that we had a typical sodium, a low sodium level, and then you can see that the energy levels and the carbohydrate proportions were similar between the 2 prepared meals. The major contrast, as well as the potassium, the major contrast was in the sodium, and this was true for all 3 calorie levels. Okay. And these are just some pictures from the field. This was, very much a volunteer effort. They didn't have a clinical space, so they graciously offered us this utility room and renovated it for us to create a nice clinical space. And then we got a table for orthostatic hypotension assessments in it was a quieter room for blood pressure. This is right next to a bathroom that we could use for the urine. And this is the volunteer chef team. They came in extra hours, the mornings and lunch times to prepare these blinded meals, and we delivered them directly to people's homes. And we had about 20 volunteers. A small study, but it was very informative in many ways. And it was an older population, predominantly female, with blood pressures in many would consider a not bad range, 120/60. A lot of hypertension medication use and some mixed reporting with respect to fall risk factors. And this is the effects on blood pressure that were observed. So in those with typical sodium, there was a net non-significant pre-post change of about 5 millimeters of mercury. And then the low sodium group had about 11 millimeters of mercury reduction. You can see everybody on the low sodium had a reduction in their blood pressure over the course of the study, even the folks starting a little bit lower. This didn't quite clear statistical significance. I think power was a major factor there. But I will point out a couple interesting things. I think this change at least was in the right direction with regard to urine sodium. And then we found a good construct validity in that the changes in the sodium really had strong changes in systolic blood pressure observed in the study. So certainly something feasible for this population that could be scaled to other similar centers. The findings are suggestive for benefit in normotensive hypertensive adults, but safety, I think, is still a good question. And we'd been in discussion with HUD leadership in New England. Apparently, they have over 200 facilities that serve residents' food and meal plans, and so certainly could be an opportunity for some scalable intervention. And then our current work on grocery delivery for Black residents of Boston. So this is the Go Fresh trials. So we focused on these areas in red, which are identified as urban food deserts, now kind of better termed food priority regions. And the idea was if we could overcome barriers to access to healthy groceries. So these are regions that have low concentration of grocery stores, lower medium income. If we take groceries patterned after the DASH diet, deliver them to people's homes at a quantity that people could enjoy as a family, can we improve blood pressure? Right? And that's the basic idea. And this was informed in part by this work by George Howard from University of Alabama. He did this really nice JAMA paper in the regards cohort. Then they found that one of the strongest, the largest mediators of excess hypertension risk among Black adults in the United States was diet. And so if we intervene on diet, perhaps we can really effectively influence this important risk factor. And there were limitations in prior studies that we felt like we needed to try to address with GoFresh. So we know in the tightly controlled setting, DASH was very effective at reducing blood pressure. But in a small study we did, so I was peripherally involved with this 5+ nuts and beans. They provided $30 per week of high potassium foods. And then in a small study that I helped lead called DIGO, it's focused on gout, but we did blood pressure, provide DASH groceries. We provided $105 per week, about $5 a meal, $15 a day, compared to 100% replacement with DASH sodium. And what you can see looking at the fruits and vegetables servings, well, providing more groceries resulted in more consumption of fruits and vegetables servings, slightly better reduction in urine sodium, blood pressure heading in the right direction, still falling short of DASH sodium, and the same with LDL cholesterol, heading in the right direction, but still not quite where we want it to be. So our thought was, let's provide enough for the individual to completely replace all their caloric needs, and people like to share with their family members. Let's provide groceries, healthy groceries for the family as well. And so this was our basic schematic. And after several years of trying, it wasn't easy. It took us 3 years to get funded. We ended up getting 2 studies funded. So we were able to look at one group with treated hypertension and another group without treated hypertension. And so getting back to the question, we'll be able to answer how does this work in the setting of treatment and no treatment. But we're following people for, we have an active phase of 12 weeks where people get groceries, and then we follow people over time for another 3 months, and then another 6 months after that, where we do a telephone call at the very end. One group gets $500 a month stipend that they can spend however they want and some information about DASH, so it's self-directed. The others get all of their calories replaced with extra following a DASH pattern to feed their families. These are a number of the assessments we're doing, so a lot of rich data collection. The intervention involves a weekly call with a dietitian to order groceries for the week, assess compliance, provide education on fundamentals of grocery shopping. And we've developed in collaboration with Black chefs in the Boston area. We have 24 demonstration videos and assembled a number of DASH recipes that folks can use to apply with the groceries to try new things and to incorporate new ideas of cooking ideas into their weekly routine. We focus on calorie levels, sodium, potassium, and food serving targets, and we budget around $250 a week, which is a substantial amount, but it gave us a lot of flexibility. We tried to not have dollar restrict the intervention. And our goal was to encourage people to hit 28 servings of fruits and vegetables, 14 servings of low-fat dairy, 28 to 41 ounces of meat, 45 servings of nuts, seeds, and legumes, and 36 to 49 servings of grains. So again, modeling after the DASH pattern. These were our major targets. It was low in sodium, higher in potassium, low saturated fat, very similar to DASH, and adhering to these ratios that were pulled from the DASH sodium trial. We had a sliding scale to account for up to 5 adults at dinner time, and that included children. So folks could share as they would. And we went over a small didactic each week. So we went over principles of DASH, food storage to reduce waste, a big challenge with fresh fruits and vegetables, sodium, potassium, food safety tips, favorite meals, exploring something new, nutritional labels, estimating proportions, strategies to increase fruits and vegetable servings, easy meal prep tips. And then we tried to make things more hands-on, experiential. People could create their own meal plans and recipes, adapt the recipe with the dietitian. We focused on special events, restaurants, making Dash work for your family, and then a recap. And then we had a special module around the holidays. And we followed a counselor guide that was audited by external folks for over time to ensure standardization and consistency. We partnered with the Roxbury Public Library and then also a teaching kitchen at Bowden Street Health Clinic in Dorchester to work with the Black chefs to record some nice videos that we share with people on YouTube. And as part of our dissemination plan, we'll be sharing after the study. But I think these were really wonderful to highlight local chefs, engage the community, and then also bring in cultural tie-in that was relevant to our participants. We spent a lot of time engaging the community around the study, and I think it's really been a real learning experience for us. We've learned a lot about engaging community partners, but it's also been incredibly rewarding, and some of the relationships we've developed over time have been quite durable. Here are just some examples of different community events, some churches we would go to give health talks, some senior events that we participated in. This is us doing some blood pressure screenings in a church basement. And this is at a local YMCA. We've had quite a bit of web traffic over the past year, about over 36,000 unique visitors. These numbers are now, our total is now over 9,000 people have expressed interest in the study. It's been a tremendous effort. But one source of, I think, at least confirmation that we are aligned with participant interest is that our word of mouth referral source now is over 1,000. And so these are people who were referred by friends and family who were in the study, who had a good experience. So I think that accounts for a lot of our participation. 80% of our participants are from Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and High Park, which for me is what we were targeting. This is the focus, and I think we've achieved that to some extent.
Can I ask a
We
question, Dr.
Yes, yeah.
One thing that I don't believe I've heard you talk about is mindfulness. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the importance of having a mindfulness practice when it comes to healthy eating.
Yeah. So mindfulness is very important. And I think, for blood pressure, there's different ways. So for blood pressure, there's long been this relationship between stress and blood pressure. Now, the evidence is tricky to establish for stress reduction and blood pressure because there can be a lot of different approaches to mindfulness techniques, stress reduction techniques that can vary from person to person. And you might say there's more heterogeneous effects on a given population. So whereas weight reduction, sodium, they are more consistent. Stress reduction there might be something that works for one person, might not work as consistently for somebody else. So that's tricky. Mindfulness. We're currently exploring mindfulness with the Chan School in a senior residence in Connecticut, actually. And that's more holistic. We're going to try to encourage mindfulness when it comes to approaching eating. So sometimes people will say, well, that means taking time to savor food, to chew the food, to slow down the eating process, not rush it, so that natural processes of feeling full can kick in. And I think that there's a lot of value to that. And so there's some direct blood pressure benefits, but there might also be kind of appetite and caloric intake benefits as well. the benefits of slowing down the chewing process, the digestive process, could also extend to exposure to micronutrients and the ability of the body to absorb them by masticating further. I think there's a lot to be explored there, but you're absolutely right. That is another aspect of this that I think we should consider. Appreciating food in different ways. A lot of times people gravitate to sodium because we are exposed to such high sodium levels that when we don't taste it, we notice its absence. It can take time, but we can adjust our taste down to not experience such sodium. And then you go back, you go out to eat, and it's like, oh my goodness, there's so much salt there. We kind of want to get that. We want to withdraw a little from the sodium. Mindfulness can be an effective behavioral tool to kind of make that transition and to appreciate other aspects of food. Um, Thinking back to my experience with the Carroll Center for the Blind, I remember talking with one client, this young girl that I was job coaching, and she didn't have a sense of smell and her taste was limited. She appreciated the shape of food, the consistency of the food. And I remember having that conversation, learning a lot from her and realizing, there's a lot of other ways to enjoy foods that go beyond just simple taste. So, great.
Much.
Yep. Great. And I know I'm kind of out of time. Um, so I'll just skip over, we've looked a lot at representation, how we can get the word out, and we're excited. We will be finishing the study this coming spring, and at some point hope to share results maybe with you all as well. Um, the AHA has partnered with us to roll out, even though we haven't finished yet. They want us to roll out across the country. So we're just launching Go Fresh Southeast, and we're going to be working with Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida to extend this model in a kind of decentralized strategy to see if we can reach more families. And we're also partnering with 6 different sites across all the major inhabited continents to see if we can develop universal principles in healthy grocery selection to model DASH in each person's own culture in their own country environment using locally sourced groceries. So we're excited about that and hoping to be successful with that study in the coming years. So,
One question that just
yeah.
came up related to the DASH diet. Where can we find out more about the DASH diet resources?
So the NHLBI, at least used to have a lot of quite a few resources on healthy eating that you can access in Google. There are a lot of review articles. Laura Svetkey, Svetkey from Duke, has a cookbook on DASH eating that she was one of the original DASH investigators from Duke. So there are plenty of materials to learn more about the DASH pattern. I like DASH because it breaks things down to the nutrient level and the food group level. So, we might say, well, whatever they were eating in 1990s, that's not going to be anything I would eat right now. I'm not sure those products are available. My family's very different. My culture is different. I don't know. The reality is we could have the same culture and have very different preferences. Dash is designed that way to accommodate that. And you can target the fruits, you can choose the fruits and vegetables you enjoy, that your family enjoys, at the proportions recommended to achieve a DASH diet. And that's the principle of Go Fresh, is that everybody, regardless of culture, can eat a DASH diet. Right. Well, I'm so grateful to everybody for this opportunity to share about our work. I'm passionate about this. I love talking about this topic, and I think I always learn more talking about it and listening to questions on it. So thank you so much.
Oh, wait, we have one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
no, I'm sorry, it was a thank you.
Okay.
It was
Well,
a
thank
thank
you.
you. And also I want to thank you, Dr. Jurassic, and also special thanks to Beth Israel Deaconess for sharing this important information about eating for a healthy heart. And if you would like to hear this presentation again, we are going to be posting the recording on our wellness speaker page on the Boston JCC website. Also, we have a limited quantity of blood pressure monitors available. I'll be emailing all people who have registered for this webinar. And if you would like to pick up a free monitor, you can do so. So that's it. My email is hwhite@jccgb.org if you have any questions about JCC's classes. And yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care. Good evening.